So I'm just going to talk about plant nutrition and healthy plants. I think so often everyone focuses on pests and diseases and trying to control them, but I think the age we're in now with less pesticides and more interest in bio, looking at nutrition can stop a lot of the problems that you can get. So that's where I'm coming from really. So we just look at a plant and we think of plants as being quite primitive. We think about animals as being really advanced and they're mobile and they can go and hunt things. But actually plants are much cleverer and they can mine all the resources they need from the soil. So if they're short of nutrients, they can expand their root systems and go off and search for trace elements and all sorts of things. If they're in a dark place, they can grow towards the light. And plants, can assimilate most things they need by themselves. Now obviously we take it a step further and we put a huge tree in a small pot and we concentrate the problem. They can't go and search for these things. So we have to have a program that is going to give them the best nutrition. And quite often, we can look at the nutrition and make sure we don't come across problems. So if we take a technical approach to it, we can minimize the problems that we're going to get. So if you look at a plant, it can assimilate most of the things it needs itself in terms of the light. If it's got carbon dioxide and water, it can do most of the things it needs. And it's fairly self-supporting. And again, it can take in CO2, it can make glucose, it releases oxygen, which is very important to us, but it also takes up water. So those are the key ingredients for a plant. And we get fixated about the other things, what we call the major elements, the minor elements and the trace elements. And these are equally important to the plant, but when we look at the breakdown of a plant, 95% of the elements the plant can sort out itself, the carbon, the hydrogen and the oxygen. We're only talking about 5% here. So it's quite interesting, but they're still important to the plant. And the reason they're called major elements, minor elements and micro elements or trace elements is the amount that the plant requires of them. So they're equally important to the plant, but nitrogen is very important and a trace element is important, but you need less of it. So if we took a plant leaf and we pounded it down to the atoms and we sort of counted them, you would find for every million atoms of nitrogen, there was only one atom of molybdenum, which is a trace element. So, but equally, if the molybdenum was short, the plant would show a deficiency symptom. So it's an incredible thing. Now, as a plant grows, it requires slightly different nutrition throughout its growth stages. And particularly when a plant is first growing from a cutting or a plug or a seedling, it needs quite a bit of phosphorus to develop the roots and the buds. It needs quite a lot of calcium throughout its life, particularly in cell walls as it's expanding and growing. So equally, if it falls short of one of these things, you're going to get a deficiency coming in. And as it gets further through the crop, nitrogen is very important for growth, but as it reaches maturity and wants to flower, potassium is more important. So when we formulate a feeding program, we take these things into account. And we can make it very simple with water-soluble feeding. We have different products for the different growth stages. And generally, Universal Blue is a sort of balanced analysis between the nitrogen and the potassium, and you'll get nice balanced growth. But you reach a point when you want to finish the plant or keep it compact and encourage flowering, and then you would move to a higher potassium formula to give those sort of things. And we have a product called Universal Orange. And we conveniently colour dye our products if you use a water soluble, so that you can make it easier for use. But equally, you can use an Osmocote product as well. But when we look at nutrition in terms of a plant, it's the whole package. You need to get the culture right, and if you've got the pH wrong, or the growing media or the water, or the temperature's wrong, you've got too little or too much fertiliser, it's just as important as applying the correct amount of water to the media. So all these things are important. So if you fall down on one of them, you're going to get a problem. So you can have all the iron, the magnesium and the nitrogen that the crop needs. If you don't provide enough water, you're not going to get a healthy crop. And that's where I'm coming from really. And when we look at the plant roots, they're taking up little ions around the roots, and these are bound onto the peat or the soil or whatever particles are in there, and they sort of compete. So if you have too much of one of these ions, it can restrict the uptake of something else. So that's really important to get things in balance. So if you apply too much nitrogen, Yeah, you'll get some growth, but you'll also restrict the uptake of potassium and things like that, and you may get unhealthy growth. You might get stretched growth, and this sort of growth is unsustainable to the plant. So when you move the crop outside, it can be, blown in the wind, need more water to keep it going, but also under protection, you're going to get botrytis and other diseases coming into this soft growth. So if you get things right, you can avoid a lot of the problems. We talk about pH all the time. It's just important to realise it's a logarithmic scale. You don't have to worry about that too much, but if you move from pH 6 to pH 7, it's 10 times more alkaline. And if you move from 5 to 7, it's 100 times more alkaline. So you may not think the difference between 5 and 7 is very much, but it's quite a dramatic difference in the alkalinity or the acidity. And that has a big effect on the plant nutrients. So it's very important that, if you're growing plants, that you specify the pH for that crop. And any growing media manufacturer or product you buy should be at the right pH for that. The water is very crucial. Water is an increasingly scarce resource. So traditionally people have used mains water, that they're now using borehole water and also recycling water. And they all have different properties. Hard water, can raise the pH. Soft water appears very nice, but it's very low in other nutrients like calcium and magnesium. So it's important to take this into account when you change your water source. The reason pH is important is that at high and low pHs, some of the elements are less available. And when you look at the thinness of the line, that shows you that, above 6.5, a lot of these elements aren't very readily available. So that's when problems start to occur. And if you get high pH, classically you'll see iron deficiency. So the iron is immobile in the plant, so it's required at all times. So if the pH locks up the iron in the growing media, the plant can't take it up, and you get this quick deficiency. But some crops do like an acid pH, so in terms of ericaceous plants. So again, it's about getting the right pH for the crop. And the water, when we talk about water, we talk about the pH of the water, but it gets a little bit more complicated. We have to look at the bicarbonate, which is how limey the water is. If you have hard water, you'll start to see white deposits on the leaves and on irrigation systems and things like that. And that's an important thing to consider. So if you do have that sort of water, we do have feeds that will help reduce that. And if you use the right feed, you can keep the leaves clean, else you're going to end up with deposits on the leaves. And it's all about saleability of the crop, but also the pH can rise. So these are things to consider. So it's important to take a water sample and not just look at the pH, but also look at the alkalinity there. And these are the sort of things we can advise on. And if you look at this, you'll remove a lot of the problems you can potentially get. And we can look at it in more detail. And once you know the sort of water you've got, you can use a hard water or a soft water product for the right growing phase. So whether it's for balanced growth or compact flowering, we can advise a product for that, specific to the crop. But you're all growing plants or working with plants, and observation is really key to it. So it's really important to look at the plant and try and see if you have a deficiency, where is it occurring in the plant. So if it's occurring in the tips of the plants, it's generally iron or calcium deficiency. And iron will be like a yellow leaf. It's really obvious to see. Calcium deficiency, you'll see this browning around the leaf. Or if you're growing tomato plants, you'll get blossom end rot on the tomatoes. They're quite characteristic. Quite often, the whole plant can be a little bit pale, and that's probably nitrogen deficiency. They just need more feed, full stop. But one of the commonest things we see is magnesium deficiency in the older leaves. You get like a Christmas tree effect with green veins and yellow between it. And these are things that are quite easy to solve, but it's far better if you can anticipate it and put the feeds on before that. We have some posters which give you some of the deficiency symptoms, and there's also an online app you can look at and diagnose some of the problems you could potentially get. But we're always available to help with problems. We have a team around the country that can help with these sort of things. But I just said about trace elements earlier. They're required in very small quantities, but if you have too little, you'll get a deficiency, which is quite dramatic. This is boron, but too much, and you can also get a problem. So it's really important not to go carried away with these things and take some proper advice before you pump loads of iron onto a plant or boron if you think you've got a deficiency, because you might overdo it. And this is a good picture of iron deficiency. It's one of the commonest things I see in the tips of the new growth, and it's quite easy to sort out. But often it can be a symptom of other things. So always look at your plants really closely, and often it could be a sign of overwatering, or you could have a root disease. So a fungus could be attacking the roots, reducing the uptake of iron from the plant and causing a deficiency. So it might not just be nutrition, it could be another aspect. So always look at your plants, see if it's over all the plants or maybe just in a certain corner. It could be a drainage problem or a flooding problem, but it's just a good tip. But it affects lots of different plants, and you'll see this real yellowing in the tips of plants. And even on conifers you get this yellowing. So it's quite a common problem. And we mentioned molybdenum earlier. It's required in the least quantities in a plant. But if you have a pH problem, you see quite a dramatic effect in a Philadelphus, So this is why nutrition is important. And don't overdo it, because if you put too much fertilizer on, you can damage particularly young plants. But if it's warm and hot, just be really careful about putting fertilizers on, because you can cause scorching on the leaves, damage to the roots, and encourage disease. Obviously, you can use Osmocote, so you can use a controlled release fertilizer, and we can advise on how much to put in, and that will release over the season of the crop in line with the needs of the plant, depending on the rate you use. So that's a really easy way to do it, but there's always a longevity that you can use, whether it's 3 to 4 months, 8 to 9 months, or 12 to 14, and that's what most professional growers would use, particularly on nursery stock. It assures that the crop's got what it needs at all times. But there's always a water-soluble solution if you need to top up. We do get extreme weather these days, and if you get a couple of weeks of really heavy rain, you might need to supplement a little bit just to get some nutrition back into the crop. But if we get it right, we're always looking at the plant demand. So we're trying to match what the plant needs and have just enough, not an excess, but not fall below this line. And if we get it right, you'll get healthy plants. Often you've got plants left, or you bought plants in that haven't really been fed recently, and top dressing is quite a good alternative then. You can green plants up very quickly and keep them green for several months, and that's always a good option, keeps the plants saleable. So we see it's more and more popular, top dressing now, I would say. So just a couple of checkpoints. If you're putting fertilizers on, just make sure you understand the rates and ask advice and check the label, because it's quite easy using a dosatron to get the wrong rates or make the wrong stock solution. We've got lots of information on the stand on rates. Don't overdose. It's not good for the plants to have too much fertilizer. And also be careful if you're applying pesticides as well. Some people are mixing them together. You need to be really careful that you don't get scorching on the leaves. And if you do have a problem, speak to somebody, get an analysis and get a proper diagnosis, and then we can sort the problem out. But hopefully, a bit of thought before you grow the crop or during the crop, you can avoid a lot of problems. Thank you very much.